and Luke in common. And finally, he used a source scholars designate M. M is just means Matthew. This is material common sayings unique. And finally, he used a source scholars designate. Moving on now to the Gospel of Mark. Now, Mark is the shortest and probably the earliest surviving account of Jesus's life. The Gospel was written in Greek. Everything in the New Testament is written in Greek, by the way. Nothing is written in the language of Jesus, which is Aramaic, and was probably written around 65 to 70 AD. Its anonymous author was a Greek-speaking Christian, probably living outside of Palestine. The Gospel begins with Jesus as an adult and presents Jesus as the Son of God who heals people, casts out demons by the power of God, but who is opposed by the Jewish authorities. Virtually everyone seems to misunderstand him. For Mark, though Jesus was the expected Messiah, he did not come to overthrow the forces of evil, but to suffer and die on the cross. So this is the earliest gospel that we have. Now, I just want to address very briefly exactly who is the Jewish Messiah in Judaism at that time and beforehand, and what was his role in history. I'm just going to quote a few words from this marvelous book by Bart Ehrman, who's a professor in the States, a New Testament scholar, The New Testament, a Historical Introduction to the Early Christian Writings. And on page 90, he has a little box saying the Jewish Messiah. And he says something very interesting and is often not known. I think I've not come across a Christian who accepts this, but it's historical fact. He says this: in no source prior to the writing of the New Testament, however, is there any reference to a future Messiah who is to suffer and die for the sins of the people. This notion appears to be a Christian creation. It may represent a combination of the belief in a future messianic deliverer with the notion that the one who is truly righteous suffers, a notion expressed in such passages as Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53. Surprisingly, for many Christian readers, the term Messiah never occurs in these passages. Now, Christians normally think the word Messiah does occur. I've spoken to countless Christians, and they always tell me that Jesus, the Messiah, is spoken of in Isaiah 53. The thing is, if you actually read the chapter, it never mentions the Messiah. It's actually speaking in the past tense about something that's already happened. So going to move on to the Gospel of Luke. Luke was written around 80 to 85 AD by a Greek-speaking Christian, probably outside of Palestine. Among his sources are Mark, Q, and L. So he, like Matthew, uses Mark. He uses this common source he shares with Matthew called Q, Quell, German for source, and material unique to himself called L. Not very imaginatively, obviously it means Luke. He dedicates his book to an otherwise unknown person, Theophilus, who may have been a Roman official, or the name may be symbolic, referring to the Christian audience as those beloved of God. That's the literal meaning of the word. What's interesting, I think, for Luke, Jesus was born a prophet, preaches as a prophet, heals as a prophet, and dies as a prophet. For Luke, Jesus dies as a martyr. He doesn't die as a sacrifice for sin. And we'll see how we know that shortly, inshallah. And lastly, the gospel according to John. This gospel is the last canonical gospel to be written, probably around 1995 AD, traditionally ascribed to John, the son of Zebedee, one of Jesus' disciples. There are many reasons to doubt that ascription. It was written in Greek, probably outside of Palestine, but John is very distinctive among the four Gospels. Few of John's accounts of Jesus's words and deeds are in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and few of the earlier Gospels accounts are in John. John has very different emphases. For example, and you may have noticed this, in the fourth Gospel, John, Jesus goes around publicly saying some extraordinary things. He says, I am the light of the world. I am the resurrection and the life. Before Abraham was, I am. And other similar sayings. These are called the I am sayings, the ego eimi in Greek sayings. The saying, by the way, before Abraham was, I am, is meant, scholars think, to refer to the divine name in Exodus, the Tetragrammaton. Jesus takes on his lips in the Gospel of John. What's interesting is that these extraordinary claims on the lips of Jesus, which are often referenced by evangelicals and C.S. Lewis and great Christian writers, are only found in one gospel, the Gospel of John. And one of the reasons why historians, nearly all historians, doubt that Jesus actually said any of these things is because of all the other sources we have, Mark, Matthew, Luke, M, L, and Q that I've mentioned. In none of these earlier sources does Jesus ever speak like this. If Jesus actually gone around saying, I am the light of the world, surely someone would have thought that was rather interesting and actually bothered to include it in their gospel. Luke, for example, says, Dear Theophilus, I've written this orderly account so you may know the truth of everything that has happened amongst us. He fails to mention that Jesus publicly went around saying these extraordinary statements. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the good shepherd. Jesus doesn't say this anywhere else in the Bible. And because it's the last gospel to be written, it seemed to be historically unreliable, much more so, certainly compared to the other gospels. Let's take a sip of English tea, because as an Englishman, I must have my tea.
Of course.
Even when it's really, really hot outside. Now, I want to explain to you a technical look. There are a lot of controversial things about the Western historical critical method. It's packed full of assumptions about the nature of humanity, about the nature of history, the nature of God. It's quite secular. It rules out the miraculous. It tends to rule out genuine prophecy. It tends to have so you'd see the Quran, for example, as a book like any other text. This is a presupposition of the historical critical method. We're not going to go into that so much, but I do think that the HCM, as it's sometimes called, has sometimes produced some remarkable discoveries. And I want to share one of these remarkable discoveries. It wasn't recent. This was in the middle of the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century. And it's called the solution to the synoptic problem. Now, what is this synoptic problem? Well, the word synoptic is a Greek word originally, coming from syn and optic, so seeing together, in other words. The thing is, if you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke in the original Greek, and they share many stories in common. For example, the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist. And if you look in the story in Matthew, in two of the Gospels, and you put them side by side in Greek, you will notice they're virtually identical in Greek. Not just the sayings of Jesus or John the Baptist, but incidental details, narrative details. It's the same, exactly the same, verbatim, apart from one or two words which are slightly different. And scholars have concluded, rightly in my view, that someone is copying from someone. This level of uniformity and verbal identity is impossible to explain except by someone copying from someone else. And you see this over and over again when you look at the stories or the sayings or the passages in the Gospels. You put them side by side. Clearly something's going on. Now, why is this a problem, the synoptic problem? Because sometimes, even though whole passages are clearly copied from each other, you get interesting differences. Sometimes one version of the story will be changed slightly in ways it's not found in perhaps the original, which is in Mark. Mark is the earliest gospel that is copied. And so what is going on here? Why are we sometimes seeing such similarity and sometimes a little bit of difference? Is this significant? Does it matter? And it turns out it matters absolutely enormously. So what I want to do is share with you examples. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example now, which I really always mentioning it at Speaker's Corner, so you probably heard it before. In the Mark's Gospel, chapter 10, we read the following story. I know it by heart. A man comes to Jesus and says, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus says to him, "Why do you call me good? There is no one good but God alone." Okay. Now, when I first read that, I thought, as a Christian, I thought, this is very odd. Jesus is apparently denying his divinity. This can't be right. So it set me off to look up the solution to this problem in biblical commentaries. It didn't really help very much. But what's interesting, if you look at Matthew's version of the same story, remember the standard consensus idea is that Matthew copies and borrows Mark, and and sometimes makes little differences. If you look at Matthew's version of exactly the same story, he's copied. It's in Matthew 19, and I read from my trusty, the New Revised Standard Version, which is the gold standard of English translations. It says this: "Then someone came to Jesus and says, 'Teacher, what good deed must I do to have eternal life?' And he said to him, 'Why do you ask me about what is good? There is only one who is good. If you wish to enter into life, keep the commandments.'" Now, if you're a good scholar, one of the things you have to do is to pay very close attention to detail. You've got to really look at the text attentively, carefully. And what they've noticed is in Mark 10, Jesus says to the guy who says, "Good teacher, why do you call me good? There's no one good but God alone." In Matthew's version of the story, Jesus says, "Why do you ask me about what is good? There's no one good but God alone." You see the difference? This is a subtle difference, but why has Matthew, who has otherwise copied Mark word for word, why has he made this little change? Now, in some of the commentaries I've read, just to mention one by a guy called Jimmy Dunn, professor of New Testament studies at the University of Durham here in England. Now, he's a Christian, isn't he? A Trinitarian. He's a Methodist lay preacher. I mention that because his bias, if it's anywhere, is towards affirming Christianity. He has no interest in causing doubt or problems for people, obviously. And he said about this passage, he said, and I'm paraphrasing very, very loosely here, that when Matthew was written towards the end of the first century, it was widely believed by many Christians that Jesus, not all Christians, but many Christians, that Jesus was divine, certainly by Matthew's community. And so when Matthew was writing his gospel for his community, clearly when he came across this passage in Mark, there's something wrong with the passage. And so he changed it to remove the embarrassment, and this is the word that Jimmy Dunn uses, the embarrassment of Mark's apparent denial, or Jesus' apparent denial of his divinity in Mark. So he makes Jesus, his denial of his divinity is removed. Okay, so this is one example of what's called redaction criticism. Redaction is a fancy word that scholars like to use for editing. Criticism means the critical approach. This is, the standard kind of scientific methodology. So redaction criticism, which really came to the fore in the 1950s, placed in Germany and elsewhere, really majored on this. How did the later Gospels change their earlier sources? And what does this tell us about the writers' opinions, their biases, their theological perspectives, their views about Jesus, for example? This is one example of how a later gospel writers changed the words of Jesus to remove what they saw as an embarrassment. Another example, which I love to mention as well, in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, Jesus says this. Now, when I say Jesus says X and Jesus says Y, I'm just going by what the Gospels say. I don't know what he really said. I wasn't there. Okay, and later we'll look at how we as Muslims should approach the New Testament, particularly how the Quran can help us to understand the truth of the matter. So I'm going to leave that towards the end. So according to Mark 10:45, Jesus says, "For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Extraordinary verse. Here Jesus seems to be saying that my life and my death particularly is a ransom, an atoning sacrifice, My death somehow frees you, maybe from sin, judgment, condemnation. And Christians will point to this verse. It's in Mark, after all, very early. So, as I mentioned, Matthew and Luke copy Mark. What does Luke do with this passage? Well, he copies it, not surprisingly. But guess what? He leaves out a verse of the whole passage. Guess which verse he leaves out? This verse, Mark 10:45. He deletes it, so to speak. He omits it. He doesn't include it. Why on earth would Luke not include such a juicy verse, such a theologically, soteriologically significant verse? But Mark, why would he leave it out? Well, I don't have time to go into the technicalities, but the consensus of many historians is that for Luke, as I said earlier, Jesus is a prophet who dies as a martyr. He does not die as an atoning sacrifice. There is nothing about Jesus' death in itself that somehow affects our relationship with God, or somehow is a sacrifice, or somehow as an atonement. No, it's a death. He dies as a martyr. Lots of prophets have died as martyrs, and he is a martyr too, according to Luke. So when one of his sources, because Luke uses Mark and L and Q, when one of his sources has Jesus saying that he is a sacrifice, apparently, this is obviously wrong. So he omits that particular verse. For Luke, his death certainly happened. And in his second book that Luke wrote, the book of Acts, the preaching of Peter and Paul and others, they certainly speak of Jesus' crucifixion. But what's interesting is the death there in Acts, the book of Acts, has no intrinsic significance. What it does, the preaching is meant to call people to repentance. Look, you crucified your Messiah. You know, this is terrible. You should repent of your sin and turn to God, and God will forgive you. So in Acts, there's no reference to Jesus dying as a sin offering or a sacrifice or as a ransom for many, because Luke doesn't agree with that. So he corrects Mark. So both Matthew and Luke are correcting poor old Mark here. So I think there are many examples I can give how the later gospel writers change the words of Jesus or add to them. In fact, one of the biggest changes, of course, is that in Mark, the story begins with Jesus beginning his ministry. There's no story about his growing up, his childhood, no story of the virgin birth, nothing. And at the end of Mark's gospel, there are no resurrection appearances. Now you're saying, how can that be? If you get your Bible out, there are resurrection appearances, but no. If you get a good translation, like the NRSV, which, as I say, is the one preferred at universities, it will tell you at the end that these resurrection appearances were written by unknown scribes later on, and they're not in the original manuscripts, not in the early, we don't have the originals. They're not in the early manuscripts, like the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus. So it is known that these resurrection stories are not part of the original early Gospel of Mark. But this is obviously terrible if you're a Christian. So Matthew and Luke add their own resurrection stories, which are mutually contradictory, and they add a story about Jesus' birth and Mary and the virgin birth and so on. I'll just give you a third example, which I think is really interesting. In Mark 7:19, Jesus, there's a story there about the disciples not washing their hands before they eat, and they're criticized by some of the Jewish leaders. And Jesus goes into the story about how what really makes you unclean is not what you eat, but what comes out of your heart. You know, greed and lust and ambition and pride and so on. And then Mark, in Mark 7:19, in parenthesis says, thus Jesus declares all foods clean. For Mark, Jesus abolishes the kosher food law. So Mark, you can eat bacon, you can eat pork, you can eat anything. He abolishes all the food laws, which are found in Leviticus in the Torah. Wow, that's big. I mean, that is pretty, as major kufr, isn't it, really? Now, what does Matthew do? So Matthew copies Mark, and guess what Matthew does? I'm sorry to sound a bit predictable now, but that's the point. Matthew deletes this verse. He omits it. He doesn't include it. He copies and pastes the story. You'll find it in Matthew, But lo and behold, that particular verse is missing. Why would Matthew delete or omit that verse? This is redaction criticism. This is what scholars, they're trying to work out why the later gospel are editing the gospels in this particular way. I'm not going to go into this because we don't have the time, but I want to share with you what Matthew says about Jesus's view of the law. So the Jewish law, the 613 commandments given to Moses on Mount Sinai. In Matthew 5, verse 17, we read this on the lips of Jesus, apparently. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Now, the law here is the Torah. It's not like criminal law, secular law. This is the commandments of God. Therefore, Jesus says, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So for Matthew's Jesus, and I'm not saying whether or not this is historical or not at this point, for Matthew's Jesus, Jesus is a Torah observant Jew, like modern Torah observant Jews. He obeyed the law, the Torah, what we would call the Sharia, what they call the Halakha, the Torah. The word Torah means law. It means other things, but it means instruction, law. So this is why scholars think that he deleted Mark 7:19, because frankly, he didn't agree. The laws were in force because his Jesus says you must follow them. And as an aside, I'd just like to mention what the Apostle Paul, a man who, by the way, never met Jesus, the historical Jesus, he also comments on this issue about the law. And he says in Ephesians, his letter to the Ephesians, chapter 2, verse 15, he says this, this is Jesus, has abolished the law with its commandments and ordinances, so that he might create in himself one new humanity in place of the two, thus making peace. So for Paul, that literally says he has abolished the law. Matthew 5:17 has Jesus say, do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish, but to fulfill. And, even if you break one of the least of these commandments, you'll be called least in the kingdom of heaven. So you see the stark contradiction between Matthew's Jesus and Paul's Jesus. Paul didn't preach what Matthew understood to be the real Jesus, the true Jesus, of course. So, what am I doing next? Just going to pause here when I get my notes together. Oh, yes. So, I want to share with you a few words from this guy, E.P. Sanders. Now, E.P. Sanders, who died recently, sadly, a very eminent American New Testament scholar, a specialist in the historical Jesus, taught at Duke University. And his magnum opus, for many, for the general public at least, is the historical figure of Jesus. And I do recommend this work if you want a mainstream Western academic understanding of the historical Jesus. I just want to quote to you just a couple of words about John and Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptics, as they're called. I mentioned they have quite different portraits of Jesus, the way Jesus speaks in John, he talks about the Son and the Father a great deal. He speaks of himself as a pre-existent divine being. And this contrasts with quite a different way of presenting Jesus in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Despite everything I've said, they share a common picture of Jesus in many ways. So what do we do with John? How come John is so different? And who was the historical Jesus? So E.P. Sanders says this. These are quite devastating words if you're kind of an innocent Christian in a way. He says on page 17, it's impossible to think that Jesus spent his short ministry teaching in two such completely different ways, conveying such different contents, and that there were simply two traditions, the Synoptic and John's, each going back to Jesus, one transmitting 50% of what he said, and another one, the other 50%, with almost no overlaps. Consequently, he said, for the last 150 years or so, scholars have had to choose. They have almost unanimously, and I think entirely correctly, concluded that the teaching of the historical Jesus is to be sought in the synoptic gospels, and that John's gospel, presents an advanced development in which meditations on the person and work of Christ are presented in the first person, as if Jesus sent them. This is quite serious. So put it this way. There's an academic in London, Richard Burridge, professor of New Testament at King's College here, and he's a Christian. He's a Church of England minister, a very eminent expert on the Gospels. And he explained in one of his books what he thinks what's going on with John. Whoever wrote John, and they're all anonymous, we don't really know who wrote them. Whoever wrote John believed that Jesus was the light of the world. And so he puts those words on the lips of Jesus. There's a very eminent Christian academic saying this. The author of John believed that Jesus was the resurrection and the life. He believed that he was the great I am. So he put those words on Jesus's lips. Now, Richard Burridge seems to not have a problem with this because he recognizes these statements are not historical. He still believes they're true. And this is how they get around it. This is how Christian scholars usually understand it. They may not believe Jesus said it, but they're still true nonetheless. They still believe that Jesus is the light of the world and the resurrection of the life and so on. But this is a small compensation if you have conceded that Jesus didn't go around saying these things. That Jesus did not proclaim himself divine. He did not see himself as the pre-existent Son of the Father. He wasn't, in a sense, a second God, a second divine being next to the Father. This is not history. This is, as E.P. Sanders says, it is much later advanced theological development. What I will call, this is just my view, I will call that fiction. Now, scholars don't use such nasty words. They don't say it's fiction. They don't speak like that. But I'm going to give you my view. It means it didn't happen like that. Jesus didn't speak like that. And this is, E.P. Sanders says, they have almost unanimously for the last 150 years or so thought this. I mean, that's quite a sweeping judgment. Now, he doesn't say, and I will say, that there's a caveat here. Obviously, there are some scholars in fundamentalist Bible seminaries in the American South, for example, who would say that Jesus said that because they're inerrantists. They believe the Bible, everything the Bible asserts, whether it be history, theology, anything, is simply fact and true. But these are fundamentalists who have a certain view of the Bible based on a dogmatic understanding of inspiration. But mainstream historians in the universities I mentioned before will have that view that John's gospel is largely fiction, or they might not use that word, but that's what they mean, obviously, because Jesus didn't say this stuff. What's the time? I'm going to go on for another 20 minutes, and then you'll probably want to sleep by then anyway. But because there's so many fascinating things I wanted to share with you, and we're not going to have time, unfortunately, to go into a lot of it. But
will you have time instead to have any, by any chance, just accept any questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Okay,
of course,
beautiful.
Absolutely. No, that was the idea. I just want to a couple of sentences from this book. Was actually I had this as an undergraduate. The New Jerome Biblical Commentary, the student edition, edited by Raymond Brown. If you know about New Testament studies, you'll know who he is. But the point about this huge volume thing is it's a Roman Catholic, official Roman Catholic production. All the scholars in here are Roman Catholics. It's got the imprimatur of the church at the beginning. And in the next edition, which I've got, the latest edition of this book, there is actually a preface by Pope Francis himself commending the book. So this is serious, hardcore Catholic scholarship endorsed by the highest authority in the Catholic Church, without any exaggeration. Why am I going on about this? Well, if you read its commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, remember I read that passage about, do not think I've come to abolish the law, etc. It says something really interesting. It's very, very interesting. And it talks about that passage, Matthew 5:7, and it talks about Jewish Christianity. This is the original faith of the companions of Jesus and so on. It says this on page 641. The outlook of Jewish Christianity, which as a separate movement was eventually defeated by Pauline Christianity, the Christianity of Apostle Paul, and died out, was reborn in a different form as Islam. Remember, this compendium is the Catholic Church's go-to volume for academics, written by Catholics, endorsed by the Vatican and the Pope himself. What he's saying is it's a stunning admission. And by the way, the latest edition of this volume, which I've got, guess what? It omits this verse. It's like this synoptic problem, isn't it? This verse has been removed from their latest edition. I've done a video on this. It's quite shocking, actually. Anyway, they admit that the earliest Jewish Christianity, which we'll come to in a second, we'll come to now, died out, and Paul's version of Christianity, remember the Ephesians passage, Christ has abolished the law, that took over. The original form was reborn as Islam. It actually says Islam. I mean, extraordinary admission, isn't it? Extraordinary admission from the church.
Amazing.
That the earliest faith of the disciples is now found where? In Islam. And this is in the New Jerome Biblical Commentary. You can look it up, page 643. Read the whole paragraph. It really is extremely revealing. They have no motive for saying the truth, because why would they say that? They're not Muslims, obviously.
Right.
So I want to just want to introduce you to a figure that is not widely known outside of scholarly circles, but is crucial, I think, for our story. And that is a man called James, or Jacob in Hebrew. Who was James? Well, indeed, he has been more or less whitewashed out of history. Now, this is not a conspiracy theory; he really has. But in recent decades, many eminent scholars have looked again at the historical sources, and people are now talking about him because there are lots of really early sources, historical texts that speak about James. So, just to give you a very brief synopsis, without going into too much detail, unfortunately, James was the brother of Jesus. Now, I don't mean a brother like you and I might be brothers. I mean an actual blood brother of Jesus. His dad was Joseph. Yeah. So, and this is well referenced in the early texts. And I just wanted to quote just one of these early texts from this. This is a book called The History of the Church by Eusebius, published by Penguin. Eusebius, his account of the early church is the only surviving historical record of the church during its crucial first 300 years. He was a bishop, a Christian bishop. He was born in 260 AD. And he, like many of our early sources, mentions James. This is just to prove my point. So on page 35 of this edition, there's a section saying how the apostles lived after the ascension. And it says this: the first then to be chosen by lot for the apostleship in place of the traitor Judas was Matthias, who, as has been mentioned, had been one of the Lord's disciples. And then it goes on to talk about the laying on of hands for this guy. And then it says, then there was James, who was known as the brother of the Lord. For he too was called Joseph's son, and Joseph's Christ, and Joseph Christ's father, though in fact the virgin was his betrothed, and therefore they came together, and before they came together, she was found to be with child by the Holy Spirit. This James, whom the early Christians surnamed the Righteous because of his outstanding virtue, was the first, as the records tell us, to be elected to the episcopal throne of the Jerusalem church. Now, what does that mean, the episcopal throne? Episcopal refers to a bishop. The throne refers to the bishop's seat. That's where we get the word cathedral from. Cathedra in Latin means seat. So James was the head of the Jesus movement, the first head of the Jesus movement after Jesus' assumption. And it says, and then Eusebius quotes an even earlier source, Clement, from the late first century in the outlines, quotes it thus: Peter, James, and John, after the ascension of the Savior, did not claim preeminence because the Savior had especially honored them, but chose James the Righteous as Bishop of Jerusalem. There are other quotes mentioned here as well, which I'm not going to share. So why does this matter? Well, so just to mention some of the other sources we have about James. Josephus is the Jewish historian from the first century, He was a bit of a turncoat. He went over to the Romans. But anyway, he's an eyewitness account of the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in AD 70. Books called The Jewish War. He's widely accepted as a very extraordinary historian in the 1st century. And he writes about James as well. He writes about Jesus too. But what he says about James is he says exactly what Eusebius says. That James was a pious, Torah-observant Jew. And he was widely respected by other Jews who are not Christians for his piety, for his devotion to the Torah. This is what Josephus, a 1st century historian, tells us. There are other sources, Hesepicus and so on. I'm not going to go into them. Why does this matter? Well, look at it this way. When Jesus had left the scene, had been ascended up to heaven, his followers appointed a leader. This leader was not Peter. Now, Catholics would tell you that Peter founded the church and he was the head of the church. But our records don't say that. They say James was the head of the church. And even the book of Acts in the New Testament has James issuing decrees on behalf of the believers in Jerusalem. So clearly he's absolutely central at the top of the command structure of the earliest Jesus movement. And the point is, he was a Jew. If you had asked James, I would imagine, well, what religion do you follow? Would he have said, I'm a Christian? No, he wouldn't. That term didn't exist at that time. He would have been an Israelite, a Jew who followed Moses and Jesus, peace be upon them both. So he was not what we would call a. Now, I don't know any Christian today who follows the religion of James, because they're not Torah observant Jews. That's interesting, isn't it? What did the Jews believe? Now, we're going to come now to an even more important question to do with James and Jesus and Moses and Muhammad, peace be upon them all. Well, apart from James, who's not a prophet, is this. There's a story in Mark's Gospel, chapter 12, where a man comes to Jesus again and asks him, what's the most important commandment? What's the greatest commandment? Now, I often ask Christians this very question. I say, well, Jesus was approached by a guy who I said, what's the greatest commandment? What is his commandment? And nearly always they answer wrongly. The greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. It was actually a quote from Leviticus. That's not what Jesus says. Jesus, quotes the Shema. Hear Israel, the Lord our God is one. The word Shema, by the way, simply means hear in Hebrew. Jesus is quoting Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, which is in the Torah, obviously, one of the 5 books of Moses. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And what is the Hebrew word for one? If you know Arabic, it's very, very, very similar. It's echad. Why is it so similar to Arabic? Because it's a cognate Semitic language. Okay? Arabic, Aramaic, and Hebrew are very closely related. And I remember when was it Dan Gibson, his film on the Passion of the Christ, which was filmed in Aramaic. I don't know, about 20 years ago. I know some Muslim friends of mine who are fluent in Arabic who actually saw this film at the cinema, and actually understood a great deal of it, even though it was in Aramaic. This is the language that Jesus spoke, because it's so similar to Arabic. So, and Hebrew is very similar as well. So Moses recited the Shema. This is, by the way, Jews today, when they pray 3 times a day, also recite the Shema. Jesus affirmed the Shema, obviously, in Mark chapter 12. And if you look at Surah 112 of the Quran, we read the following. Now, I can recite this in Arabic, but it'll be hugely embarrassing and painful for you as well if I actually recited it. So I'm going to do it in English. Say, he is God, the one, God, the absolute. He begets not, nor was he begotten, and there is none comparable to him. But in the Arabic, when it says, say he is God, the one, what's the word one in this passage? Ahad. Yep. Exactly. And what's the word in Hebrew? Ehad. It's the same word. Okay. Now, the reason I'm saying all this is that in terms of Akedah, in terms of theology, what we find on the in the law of Moses, in the Revelation, in the Torah, what we find Jesus affirming in Mark 12, and what we find Muhammad also affirming, and the earliest Muslim community, is exactly the same creed, exactly the same Akedah. And what I like, one of many things I like about Surah 112, which we can't go into, is its precision theology. It also includes a very nuanced critique of the Council of Nicaea's doctrine of, the Son being begotten of the Father. That's a separate issue. It's an extraordinary surah, very concise, brief, and beautiful to recite, as we do in our prayers, I know. So this is the point about the theology. Going back to Mark 12, if Jesus was a Trinitarian, just imagine he believed in the Trinity. When he was asked what the greatest commandment was, yes, he might have mentioned the Shema, but then he surely would have said, this is a great teaching opportunity after all. Well, God is the Father, who is fully God, and the Son, who is fully God, and the Holy Spirit, who is fully God. But there's not three gods, but one God. This is a kind of language that later Christians used. But Jesus fails to say this. He endorses the Shema, which is Tawheed, which expresses Tawheed, as does the Quran, obviously, express Tawheed, the truth about Tawheed, the unity and oneness of God. This is what Jesus affirms. And Muhammad and Moses, peace be upon them all, using the same language, the very same vocabulary. Extraordinary how you can demonstrate this. But Jesus doesn't say the Father is fully God, the Son is. He doesn't talk about Trinitarian theology, which is interesting. Surely he would have done if he was, as Christians claim, the second person of the Trinity. He would take that opportunity to educate everyone and preach the truth, but he doesn't do that. Again, very interesting, I think. What is next? How much time we got? Okay. Oh, yes. I just want to share with you some words from this fascinating book, which I do highly recommend if you've not come across it. It's called The Islamic Jesus by Mustafa Akyol. He's an American/Turkish scholar and journalist, quite active on social media. Now, if you've heard of him, you may not approve of him because he's quite liberal on some things and quite modest, true. But when it comes to this book and this particular work of scholarship, he's very, very good. So I personally would separate out this book from perhaps there's other ideas which we may or may not agree with. So that's what I'm trying to do here. So the book is subtitled "How the King of the Jews Became a Prophet of the Muslims." Now, this guy, Mustafa Akyol, is aware of biblical scholarship. He quotes from it. I can tell he knows what he's talking about, which is very interesting. And I want to share with you what he says about the Quran and what it says about Jesus, the historical Jesus, because it is quite astonishing what the Quran says, and I'll show you why. So I'm just going to read a few paragraphs from this book. On page 86, the images of Jesus in Jewish Christianity and in Islam are very similar, if not identical. We mentioned that the Quran insists that Jesus was the Messiah, which is interesting, for it was probably an alien concept for 7th century pagan Arabs. Also interesting is the Quran's emphasis that Jesus was sent to the Jews, that he was, as a Quran verse said, a messenger to the children of Israel. The seemingly insignificant but actually impressive point here was captured by Patricia Crone. Patricia Crone, by the way, was a very eminent Quranic scholar in Europe. I think she was Danish originally. She ended up at Princeton, I think, in the States. Very distinguished, not a Muslim at all. And she suggested, quote, that Jesus was sent to the Israelites, as the Quran claims, is an astonishing claim for a 7th century preacher to make. So she assumes that Muhammad, upon it, wrote the Quran. Well, overlook that error because it's the point she's making that's of interest. Why astonishing? Asks Mustafa Akyol. Because, he says, unless one had a sense of the historical Jesus, one would rather think that Jesus was sent to the Christians. That is, in fact, what most Muslims readily think today, imagining that Moses is the prophet of the Jews, Jesus is the prophet of Christians, and Muhammad is the prophet of Muslims. Therefore, Crone suggests, from her perspective, and this is a quote from Patricia Crone, one would have expected the messenger, Muhammad, to say that Jesus was sent to the Christians. Of course, there were no Christians before Jesus, but this would hardly have prevented the messenger from seeing God as sending Jesus to them. And even if we assume his historical sense to have been too well developed for him to do so, one would have expected him to say that the Israelites responded to his preaching by dividing into Jews and Christians, which is historically correct. But what he actually says, what the Quran actually says, is that they divided into believing and unbelieving Israelites. It's a reference to Quran 61:14. Quran 61:14. In religious terms, they split, but ethnically, they remained the same. Now, what's going on here? The point is this, that, as I've already touched on very briefly, the earliest followers of Jesus were Jews. They weren't Gentiles. They came later, particularly after the mission with Paul to the Gentiles. So Jesus' followers, even Acts says this, they were centered around Jerusalem. So the division that Jesus' preaching caused was between Israelites. It wasn't between the Gentiles and the Jews, or between Christians and Jews. The word Christian is an anachronism at this time. The point is that the Quran is making an incredibly subtle and nuanced point when it says that they divided into believing and unbelieving Israelites. This is something that is precisely correct historically. And, and this has caused marvel for Patricia Crone. Why would the Quran get it so? We know why. But for her, of course, Muhammad was the author of the Quran. So that's why she's astonished. We're perhaps less astonished. It says, according to, and then Mustafa Akyol continues, according to Jewish Christian texts, these are very early texts as well, the impact of Jesus on Jews was exactly the same, dividing them into believing and unbelieving factions. There's one document, early Jewish writing, called The Ascent of James, speaks of us who believe in Jesus and the unbelieving Jews. And Akyol says that is a very Quranic perspective. There's something else in the few minutes I've got left I wanted to share with you, which is perhaps even more astonishing, I think, in terms of what it says about the Quran and the Sunnah and Muslim practice and what the earliest Christians did. And this is not widely known at all. So I'll just read out what he says and then comment on it in our last few minutes. Besides views about God and the prophets, there are also some striking similarities between the practices of Jewish Christianity and Islam. The former, being an extension of Judaism, of course, had dietary laws that banned pork and carrion and prescribed circumcision for all males. Beyond these well-known examples, however, Jewish Christians seem to have a practice that is found in neither Judaism nor Christianity, but only in Islam. At this point, I usually say to people, can you guess what it is? And no one ever guesses it, which is fair enough. You can comment on this in the Q&A if you want. This is the prohibition of wine. We can infer the Jewish Christian position on wine from the writings of the early church fathers. So Irenaeus, for example, in his famous work, says about the Jewish Christians, the first ones, they reject the commixture of the heavenly wine and wish it to be water of the world only. So Irenaeus is a 2nd century, what we would call Catholic theologian, I suppose. But he knew of these people. They still existed. They're called the Ebionites in the 2nd century. And also there's a guy called Hesepicus. He was a Christian chronicler of the 2nd century. And he said about James, the brother of Jesus, he drank no wine or other intoxicating liquor. In other words, the earliest Jewish Christians refrained from alcohol. And of course, the Quran also says we should refrain from intoxicants. So another remarkable similarity between the practice of us as Muslims today and the practice of Jesus, the earliest disciples, from his family. James was a member of his family. And another interesting practice of the earliest Jewish Christians was daily ablutions. And when I first read this, I thought, you've got to be kidding. And this was noted by Epiphanius, an early Orthodox Christian writer. And he noted in one of his works a Jewish Christian practice of ritual ablutions before prayer. This is wudu. Moreover, Jewish Christian males washed themselves after sexual intercourse, avoided sex during their wives' monthly periods. All this, says Mustafa Akyol, fits perfectly into the Islamic practices of ablutions before daily prayers, the washing of the whole body after sex, and abstaining from intercourse during menstruation. So, gosh, there's so much more I could go on. I'm going to leave it there. Well, I just quote, because he quotes from, he says, these parallels, and there are others, between Jewish Christianity and Islam have been noticed by Muslims as well. The Encyclopedia of Islam, published by Turkey's, or Turkiye, I should say, Islamic Directorate of Religious Affairs, has a long entry on Jewish Christians, which gives a detailed evaluation of their creed. Jewish Christians, the article concludes, represented the real message of Jesus, and their image of Jesus is the same with that of Islam. And that, for me, echoes almost what the New Jerusalem Bible commentary, New Jerome Bible commentary says about Islam as well. I did say I mentioned the Quran. There's a translation of the Quran by Muhammad Asad. We may or may not like his Mutazilite leanings, I know, but his translation of Quran 5:48 is, I think, very pertinent in this regard. So how does the Quran view itself vis-a-vis these books, these early various Jewish writings and the New Testament and the Gospels and Paul's writings? How are we to take the lead from the Quran in this? And just one verse, as translated by Asad, I think is very helpful. He says, and this is in conclusion, my final thought, and unto thee, O Muhammad, have we revealed this divine writ, setting forth the truth, confirming the truth of whatever there still remains of earlier revelations, and determining what is true therein. Judge then between them in accordance with what God has bestowed from on high, and do not follow their errant views, forsaking the truth that has come unto thee. End quote. So the Quran really is the Furqan, it's the Muhaymin, it's the criterion, it's the supervisor, it's the way we discern what is still true in the Bible. From speaking personally, I think there's much that is true and beautiful in the Bible, but also indicating what is false, basically, and pointing out mistakes, like Jesus being the Son of God, Jesus being divine, Jesus being crucified on the cross, for example. The Quran corrects and informs us about the truth of the matter. And that's part of its role vis-a-vis the earlier scriptures, which sadly have been either lost or distorted or corrupted. I'll leave it there. It's just 1 hour. So thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Ustad Paul. I really appreciate you and everything that you've been doing. I guess if anybody wants to come up, do you have a certain amount of time that you have in mind for a Q&A?
I have no particular limit. No, but we'll see how it goes. People might not have any questions anyway, so we'll see.
Sure. I'm going to bring up a couple of brothers here. Fortcraft, you're up to ask a question, Effie.
Brilliant points made. Brilliant points.
Hello, am I audible? Hello,
Yes,
do you hear me?
Yeah, audible. Yeah.
Okay, alaikum. Okay, Mr. Paul, I have a question for you. Like you talked about, like Jesus not claiming to be divine in earlier gospels and whatnot. How do Christian scholars make it sounds to me that they are being delusional and dishonest. Can you elaborate on that?
I can't comment on their intentions and their motives psychologically. I can't say if they're being deliberately disingenuous or I'm only reporting what they say, actually. there is a real sense that the Christology, the understanding of Jesus in the earliest tradition, is much lower than the high Christology we find in John. And how they deal with that. When I read academic books on this subject, they don't really talk about their psychological motives and so on. If they're good scholars, and many of them are top scholars at the world's leading universities, part of their job is not to bring in these kind of considerations. They want to just record historically, as best they understand it, what happened, or reconstruct it as best as they can. So what they do with the results of that is another question, and that's for them as private individuals, as Christian believers. But as academics, they don't tend to bring those. They just state the facts as they see them. But one of the big scandals, I think, of the church is that that Christian scholars, at least for the last 150 years, have known the truth about all this because they do the research. I mean, they're the guys who are overwhelmingly doing the academic research, with one or two exceptions, like Bart Ehrman, who's now an atheist. But they've not successfully communicated these truths or these insights and facts to the man and woman in the pew, to the people who go to church. And the irony is, the priests and pastors and bishops who head up the churches are taught at universities where these scholars exist. And so the priests, pastors and ministers know the truth, usually, but they don't pass it on to their congregations, usually. And the question is why? This is something that Bart Ehrman has discussed several times. And there are possible, we can't know for sure, but there are several possible reasons. One is, if you're a priest and you've been trained in this stuff, and you tell your flock that you're going to lose your job, you're going to be in trouble with your boss, the bishop or something. Or it could be that you just don't know how to talk about. How do you talk about these things in a sermon on a Sunday morning? Or it could be they're just cowards and we won't bother the faithful with these disturbing, insights into the synoptic problem, redaction criticism, and and so on and so on. So they could, but whatever the reasons are, that generally speaking, with some exceptions, these Christian leaders don't pass on what they know to the ordinary people who go to church on Sunday. So they're ignorant about it, generally speaking, which I think is a scandal in my view.
I noted that, you mentioned that some, renowned scholars from the Christian side concede some statements. For example, that, any statement in the Bible or some statements in the Gospels that insinuate divinity may not have historically been made, but the statements themselves are true and the writer thought so. So it's interesting to kind of also feed onto that question that the brother asked is, the justification to believe that he is or Jesus is divine to begin with leans on these statements. And if these are stripped away historically, what do they have to lean on? That's another interesting thing.
I think you're absolutely right. And that's my point as well. But people, I mentioned Richard Burridge, Professor of New Testament Studies at King's College, who's a priest. He apparently sincerely believes, and I've got his book behind me, where he explains this, that even though Jesus didn't say, I'm the light of the world and I'm the resurrection and all this stuff, it's still true. These are still true statements in the Gospel of John. And therefore, we can believe that these are true. But on the other hand, we know Jesus didn't say them. Now, I find that intolerable. I couldn't base my salvation on that. Could you? I mean, we know in Islam we had a massive problem in the early centuries with fake hadiths. We knew they were fake. But there was an industry given to produce fake hadiths. That's why people like Bukhari and Muslim developed this extraordinary hadith criticism. They did a brilliant job. My point is this: if we were to say, well, never mind Bukhari, I'm just going to base my faith on any old hadith that I like, and I may know it's a forgery, it doesn't matter because it's true. I mean, excuse me. I mean, is it a way to take religion seriously? I don't think it is. But people do take it seriously like that. And some very eminent churchmen who do this. And I, for the life of me, can't get my head around it. I've tried, but I just can't understand it.
Absolutely. Unmasked Fitra Akhi, if you want to ask your question. Alaikum assalam.
Yes, well, there are lots of books like that, but Bart Ehrman's book, I'm just going to grab it, so I'm just going to stand up. Okay, this is the English cover. I think the US version is slightly different cover, but Bart Ehrman is a textual critic. This is his area of speciality. This book is called Whose Word Is It? The Story Behind Who Changed the New Testament and Why. And this is a very fair book, and it basically introduces the layman to the whole history of the manuscripts of the Bible, how they were corrupted, you know, and why they were changed, and so on. It's very readable, utterly compelling. I do recommend that book.
Yeah, another context. Thank you. I have another question here. Let's see. Let's see. Yeah, Abdullah, if you go ahead. Assalamu alaikum. Wa alaikum assalam.
Okay, so I have a question about your gospel, Mark. So in Mark 14:62, it says, "The Son of Man and sits at the right hand of God." And many biblical commentators say this is a claim of divinity. How do you refute this?
So, where is the reference? 14:16? Did you say?
Yeah, 14:62.
Oh, 62. I beg your pardon. Did you say 60?
Yeah.
Okay. Again, this may not be historical, but let's look at what the passage says. But he was silent and did not answer. Again, the high priest asked him, so Jesus, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed?" Jesus said, "I am." Now, thus far, by the way, a claim to be the Messiah and the Son of the Blessed is not a claim to divinity. The Messiah is a human figure in Judaism, in the Jewish Bible, and to be a son of the Blessed, David's called that the Son of the Blessed in Psalm 2.
Okay.
This is not a divine title. Then he goes on. Jesus said, allegedly, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." If this is a reference to Daniel 7, which it normally is assumed to be, if you look at Daniel 7, it talks about one like a son of man, or Barnash, a human being, basically. And the whole chapter makes it clear, because Daniel interprets this this prophecy about the Son of Man. In that context, the Son of Man means the Israelites. It's the people of the Most High. It talks about the saints of the Most High. They will have dominion, and they will be, you know, obeisance will be done to the. It's quite a supremacist chapter. But the point is this: that the Son of Man comes to the Ancient of Days. That's the expression in Daniel 7. The Ancient of Days is understood to be God. Whoever the Son of Man is, and we can discuss that, he is not God, because he comes to the Ancient of Days and receives dominion and so on. So it's not that if Jesus, whatever Jesus is, he's not Yahweh, he's not Allah, he's not the eternal God. Now, I'm willing to agree that Jesus, in some sense here, is being portrayed as divine. Now, let me explain what I mean. And this is, we've got to understand the ancient world, the ancient Greco-Roman world. In the ancient Greco-Roman world, lots of people were called divine. Lots of people understood to be demigods. For example, Philo of Alexandria in Egypt was probably the most famous Jewish biblical scholar in the ancient world. He was a Jew. He wasn't a Christian at all. But he was a Hellenistic Jew, so very influenced by Hellenism. This is the prevailing zeitgeist in the ancient world. And he wrote commentaries on the Bible, of course. He was a Bible scholar. And he wrote a commentary on the Torah, and he called Moses Theos. In the actual word, he actually used the word Theos in description of Moses. Theos is the Greek word for God. Now, did Philo think that Moses was God? No, not in the sense that he thought he was Yahweh at all. But in the ancient world, this language of divinity was thrown around much more freely than we are at all comfortable with today, be we Christians or Muslims, or whoever. For example, Plato was often called divine or a god. Augustus was called, the emperor was called divine or the son of God. Many people were called like that. If you were a great athlete and you succeeded in the Olympic Games, people could say, "Behold, a god," but they didn't mean that this person was the creator of the universe. They didn't mean what we understand by God. I mean, we even had this language today. It's not so common these days, but people used to say, at least a while ago, she is absolutely divine. You know, this movie actress, she's absolutely divine. They are not saying that she is actually God. Trust me, they're not. That's not what they mean. All right. So when I say I have no problem with accepting that Mark sees Jesus as divine, the question is, and this is a question that Bart Ehrman makes very clear, in what sense is he divine? Is he divine in the sense that God, Yahweh, is divine? No. Why? Because in Mark's gospel, Jesus dies on the cross, and what does he say? My God, why have you abandoned me? A man who was God would not say, my God, why have you abandoned me? He says in Mark 10:17, why did you call me good? There is no one good but God alone. He says in many places that Jesus went out before dawn and prayed to God. He says that. He says it in Luke as well. So he's clearly not God in the sense of God with a big G, but he might be divine in some sense that the Greco-Roman world would have understood. But I think we must be careful about importing our own modern or Islamic categories back into the first century and thinking we're understanding what's going on there and not being sensitive to the language of that time and the way it's been used. And once we achieve that cultural sensitivity, things are not quite what they might have seen at the beginning. That would be my response.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, we have brothers here who oftentimes engage interfaith discourse and these kind of quote unquote exclusive titles to Yahweh that get attributed to Jesus in the New Testament. I mean, to add on to your point, we have brothers that have mentioned that Paul himself notes that, people thought that he and Barnabas were divine at one point just for simply healing, quote allegedly miraculously, right? And they were themselves accused of being gods by the witnesses to that event. So it's very easy to understand how not only just the author of John, but many in the first and second centuries would have had these weird, perceptions, and those titles could be thrown around so loosely.
Yeah.
It's true. And there's another example, which is very popular, very, very popular with Christians in Mark chapter 2, I think it is, 2 or 3, where Jesus forgives sins. Who can forgive sins but God? Okay. And this is, at first glance, quite an interesting argument and quite, wow, Jesus forgives sins. And interesting, if you look at Matthew's version of Mark, remember Matthew and Luke copy Mark and edit them. And Matthew adds more context to what actually happened. So, it's about Jesus healing the paralytic. I'm not going to go into the whole story, but at the very end, so Jesus says, stand up and walk, but so you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. Then he said to the paralytic, stand up, take your bed, go to your home. When the crowds saw this is the last verse 8 of chapter 9. When the crowds saw it, they were filled with awe. Wow. Why? Because Jesus is God? He's just forgiven sins. Wow. He must be God. No. And they glorified God who had given such authority to human beings. You see what's happened there? Now, whether or not you're comfortable with the idea of a human being forgiving sins is not the point. I'm talking about the Christology of Matthew and Mark, all right? The crowds, the pious crowds, they were filled with awe and they glorified God. So clearly these are good guys. These are good Jews. And they glorified God who had given such authority to human beings. So clearly in Matthew's view, Jesus exercises this authority by the permission of God. And if you go, I used to be a Catholic before I became a Muslim. I was an evangelical before that. I'd been to confession in my local church. And I confessed my sins. I confessed my sins to the priest, and guess what he did? He forgave my sins in the name of the church. Now, Crazy. This is not such a big innovation because it says in John, by the way, that this is John. He confers the Holy Spirit of disciples. Whatever you forgive will be forgiven. Whatever you withhold will be withheld. The disciples themselves, even in the Gospels, were given this authority. They had a shared authority with Jesus. So one can't overload it with theological significance to somehow imply that Jesus was God if one is taking all of the evidence into account.
Absolutely. Meridius, you have a question? Oh, yeah, go ahead, son.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Yes, and thank you for pulling me.
No worries, Akhi. Go ahead.
Mr. Paul, I watch your content for over 3 years on YouTube, and I'm glad that I'm talking to you right now.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Paul, the first 4 verses of Luke, I think it's only Luke talking to his friend, saying how is he going to write the Bible. So why do they think it's verses and divinely inspired?
Okay, I tell you a little story, which may sound a little bit incredible at first, but in my view is absolutely true. The Bible nowhere claims to be divinely inspired. It just doesn't. Now, Christians will tell you, oh, it does, and they'll quote 2 Timothy 3:16. First of all, this is their favorite go-to verse, their favorite proof text, which says, all scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching and reproving and training in righteousness, etc. Indeed, it does say that, but, and this is what they always miss, if you read that verse in the context of the chapter, Paul is addressing Timothy. After all, it's the second letter of Paul to Timothy. He addresses Timothy and says, and talks about the scriptures that he knew as a youth. So Paul's writing in the 50s. He's talking to another guy called Timothy, and about the scriptures he knew as a youth. So this is in the 40s or 20s AD. At that point, I assure you, nothing in the New Testament had been written. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not written. Paul's letters hadn't been written, obviously, because he's referring to nothing had been written in the New Testament. So that verse, what does it refer to? It refers to the Jewish Bible, the sacred scriptures that Timothy knew as a youth. It can only be referring to the Jewish Bible, not to the New Testament. So there is no verse anywhere in the Bible that says the Christian Bible, Old and New Testament, is inspired, or the word of God, or revelation, or anything else. And interestingly, Paul himself, in one of his letters, in 1 Corinthians, disavows what he is saying as inspired by God. There's some teaching about, I think it's 1 Corinthians 7:12, where he's talking about divorce, and I won't go into the issues, but he's saying, what I now say to you, I don't have a word from the Lord, I now teach you. So before, he communicated a word from the Lord, whether that's Jesus or God, I don't really know, it doesn't really matter. But I now say this to you, as in distinction to that. So Paul is not claiming divine inspiration. In fact, he is deliberately distinguishing what he is saying from divine revelation in 1 Corinthians. So to say afterwards, after the fact, though he's writing the word of God, is something that he explicitly has denied that he's doing, paradoxically, in 1 Corinthians.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's it.
All right, we have another person here. Servant, did you have a question you wanted to say, Akhi?
Yeah, I mean, it was a quick question regarding the miracle of turning water into wine. We know that this miracle is ascribed to Jesus in the Christian tradition, but we know that Jesus himself, as a Galilean Jew, would have abided by the customs of what the Pharisees would have followed, right? What the early Nazarenes would have followed, typically following the Torah and the customs and traditions with that. And they weren't, either wine drinkers, or prohibition for alcohol was still constant, was still active. Interestingly enough, Robert Grant, he writes in his book, The Incredible Shrinking Son of God, he writes, miracle stories came from subsequent stage of missionary penetration into the Mediterranean world, apping the mission propaganda of hero cults and mystery religions with their commercial-like stories of their wondrous deeds of their saviors. So my question for you, Paul, is what is your view regarding this miracle of turning water into wine? Would you attribute it to more of a Pauline development, or would you say it stems from early synoptic tradition?
Well, it doesn't come from any of that tradition. It's in the Gospel of John. It's not from Paul. It's not from the synoptics. It's in the Gospel of John. Why does that matter? Well, John is seen as the least historically reliable of the 4 Gospels anyway. He freely makes up teaching of Jesus and puts it on his lips. This is what virtually all scholars believe, according to E.P. Sanders. Therefore, when it comes to anything in the Gospel of John, I'm not just going to have the default view that this is history. I'm not. I don't know is the answer to the question. But it's not found in Paul. It's not found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The changing of the water into wine is found in the Gospel of John. It's not a miracle that's found elsewhere. And so towards the end of the 1st century, maybe it happened. I don't know. But one has to be aware of where we read this stuff. It's in sometimes unreliable sources like John.
I mean, would you hold to the view that the fourth gospel was either influenced by Paul or would have an independent kind of tradition, the Pauline theology?
It is very similar to Paul in that it has a very exalted view of Jesus. Although even in John, Jesus is not identified with Yahweh. He's not identified as the Father. The Father is greater than I, he says. So there are still statements, and the Son is very subordinate to the Father. So it's similar-ish to Paul, but some scholars do see a very marked Neoplatonic influence on John. The language of the Logos, the beginning of John's Gospel, hologos, the Word. In the beginning was hologos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, is a staple of Stoicism. As well as an echo of Genesis chapter 1. And so there do seem to be some very distinctive themes in John, which are not simply just cut and pasted from Paul. But what's interesting is Paul is our earliest New Testament writer, and his high Christology is found there, that early time, but it's not found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but it is found much more in John. In terms of direct influence, I don't know. I can't answer that. I don't know. We don't have the evidence for that. But Paul never met Jesus, and John's Jesus is considerable extent fictional. So these are not terribly reliable sources, either of them.
Sounds good. Thank you very much.
Okay. Let's see. We have Amir been waiting patiently. Amir, go ahead.
Wa alaikum assalam. I have a question about Saint Athanasius of Alexandria. So basically, when I was reading one of his works in Discourse 2 against the Arians, I noticed that his interpretation in Proverbs 8, verse 22 to 23, he says that this talks about the flesh of Jesus instead of his essence, right? And I was a little bit confused because when I was reading the verse, it talks about the very beginning, right? Before the universe was. And from what I understand here, he on accident teaches that Jesus had flesh before the universe. What's your take on that, Mr. Paul?
No. Athanasius wrote another book, which I've read, called The Incarnation of the Word, which is incarnation of Jesus. So the word incarnation means taking flesh. It's like the word chili con carne, carne means meat in Latin. So it's the idea of the enfleshment of Jesus. Jesus didn't exist, by the way, as Jesus before the incarnation, Athanasius. So he existed as the Son, and he became incarnate as a human being in Jesus at a particular time and place in history. And of course, Athanasius was the great advocate of at the Council of Nicaea for the idea that Jesus is God in the same way that the Father is God. Whatever Jesus is, the Father is. Whatever the Father is, Jesus is. They're both homoousion, the same being, the same substance. Homo meaning the same, ousia meaning being or substance. They had the same being and substance. But prior to the incarnation, he wasn't called Jesus, he didn't have a body by definition. So, Athanasius was what we would call a Catholic today, or an Orthodox theologian.
Can I say something?
Please.
Yes, I understand that very clearly. I was reading his works, and as I understand it, just as you said it, but I'm being very careful with my words. I said on accident he's teaching something else, because he said that the interpretation here in Proverbs 8, 22 to 23, where it talks about that Jesus is created in his Bible, right? It says he is created. He speaks that this does not talk about his essence, right? And the context of the verse is at the very beginning, before the world was. So how can it talk about his flesh, as he's interpreting it, when the context of the verse is about the very beginning? That's what confuses me.
Okay, we would need to look at Proverbs chapter 8. We need to look at what Athanasius actually said to have a proper study of this. We can't do that at the moment. But I would say that was marginal to the main thrust of his thought in The Incarnation of the Word. That book is translated by C.S. Lewis very beautifully, actually, where Jesus, in believing in incarnation, Jesus' flesh didn't pre-exist before the incarnation, obviously. So I can't address your specific point. We need to look at what Athanasius actually wrote carefully. We need to go through Proverbs 8 and look at those verses And unfortunately, I can't do that at this time.
That's no problem. I understand. I'll post his works here and some of the mentionings where he says son of his essence, all of that stuff. But the second question, if that's okay.
Really, sorry, but this is not really germane to my talk, which is the remarkable correspondence or convergence between what Western historians are saying about historical Jesus and what the Quran says. Athanasius was alive in the 4th century, so this is long after Jesus' time, although his views came to dominate for sure at Nicaea and afterwards at Constantinople and Chalcedon and so on. But this is not really this convergence issue. This is to do with the history of historical theology, as it's called.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Amir Barakallah Fik, for the question. Okay. We have, let us know anytime, Ustad, if you have any time crunch that you need to address, but
yeah, we'll do it for longer. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Sadaka Samra, I think it's Omar. Omar, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah. Assalamu alaikum, first of all. I hope everyone is well.
So,
Paul, I wanted to ask you, right? And this is something which I've been thinking about, and I've had quite a few discussions with people about this. Now, I know Jesus Christ, he's a Jew, by meaning that he descends or comes from the kingdom of Judah, which is a common term used for Jews. Jews are from Judah. However, I'm more of the opinion that he might be a Levite in descent. And the reason why I say this is because, for example, the wife of Imran in the Quran, she vows that whatever is in her womb, which she thought at one point was a boy, she vowed that he would be dedicated to the service of the temple, which we know from biblical accounts is only for Levites.
Yeah.
And we also know that Zechariah, or majority of the prophets, for example, they are from Levite descent. Like Zechariah, for example, John the Baptist, he is Levite, and he took care of Mary. And Mary also called the sister of Aaron. Now, in one of the exegetes, Ibn Kathir, he says that this means that she is a descendant from Aaron. O sister of Aaron, she's a descendant of Aaron. Now, what do you personally think of this? Is there anything which from the Bible itself might support this claim that he is a Levite?
No, well, when I said that he was a Jew, I'm using that in an anachronistic sense. Obviously, there were 12 tribes, the eponymous founders from Joseph and Jacob and Joseph. But I'm not saying that Jesus was descended from the tribe of Judah. I'm just using this word colloquially.
Yeah.
When I spoke of as a Jew. The 12 tribes by Jesus' time, very likely, any memory of their specific lineage of the 12 tribes had been lost to history long before, probably by the time of the exile in Babylon, 500 BC. This sense of distinct tribes, they were obliterated through various historical processes. So by the time of the 1st century, we're not looking at, I know Paul says of the tribe of Benjamin and so on, but we don't really have any clear idea of the 12 tribes continuing to exist in the early church in that way, in the early centuries. Obviously, the Quran does give us information about Miriam's ancestry, clearly, from the priestly caste. So you're right. But I don't think the Bible, the New Testament, I mean, speaks of Jesus being descended from a particular lineage in that way.
Okay. Thanks. That was it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll take probably one last one here. Rabbah. Let me see. Rabbah, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. Yeah, Paul, I just wanted to ask you, Christians like to interpret verses like Matthew 2:15, where he mentions, out of son, out of Egypt, I have called my son, as being some sort of a typology, right? Yes. My question is, what's your opinion on typology and stuff?
Yes, so it's Matthew 2:15, did you say? Yeah, I mean, this is true. This is exactly what it is. It's typology. This is a genre that is popular amongst the early Christians and amongst Matthew. So the problem with typology is when Matthew in chapter 2, this was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son. This is to do with the escape to Egypt. because of the persecution of Mary and Jesus, they sought refuge in Egypt, according to Matthew. But if you actually read Hosea, prophet Hosea, in the Old Testament, which is where the prophecy comes from, it's nothing to do with the Messiah. The son in the passage, I forget which chapter it is it 6 or something, is Israel. And that's not a guess, it says that. It actually says that. So what Matthew has done, he's taken a passage which has nothing to do with Jesus at all, nothing to do with the future Messiah, it's not even a prophecy, and he's just artificially transplanted it on to his story about Jesus. And then this was to fulfill the prophecy. It's not a prophecy, but it is a kind of known genre that some Jewish writers practiced. So it's not like he's innovating in that sense. But I don't find it very convincing, because when you look where this prophecy comes from in Hosea, it's not speaking about Jesus, a Messiah, a future event, or any individual. It's talking about Israel as a nation. Out of Egypt I called myself. And then and the irony is, in that whole passage in Hosea, he talks about how God chastises Israel because of their misbehavior. He's very critical. Whoever the entity is in Hosea, God is very angry with him. And yet this was to fulfill. I mean, it really is quite a mismatch in my view. But this is typical of Matthew. He does this lots and lots of time. Paul does it as well. But by modern standards, we say they're very often misquoting the Bible to make their points. And when you look up the alleged prophecy or the prediction in the Old Testament, it either doesn't say that, they're just completely mangling it, or it's decontextualized completely with complete disregard to the natural meaning of the prophecy in its original context, which is not a prophecy at all usually. And this is famously done with Isaiah 53, which in context of the whole book of Isaiah is clearly referring to Israel and not a future prophecy of Jesus as a Messiah suffering and dying. So this is the Christian trick, if I can call it that, is to either misquote or to decontextualize. And you can prove anything. If you take something out of context and give it your own meaning, you can pretty much say anything really about anything. I mean, it wouldn't be allowed in a court because you're misinterpreting and misrepresenting the author.
Absolutely. Beautiful. And Stella, I just would like to ask one thing from my own, being that basically what we've done today is demonstrated in a beautiful way, like, at least from what I took, that there's quite literally no justification in believing that the New Testament, and specifically the 4 Gospels, are really written in a univocal sense by any means. And that's due to the omissions and of huge statements that we would expect to see across the different accounts, especially ones that are so sensitive towards the theology.
Yeah.
What would be your most plausible theory as to how the New Testament came about itself in the earliest sense? I mean, would you say it's more of a theologically motivated committee with the Gospels written in different places, possibly? What would be that's kind of the question. I know it's a little bit difficult to compose, but
it's a huge question. One could go on for hours about it. There's so much. There were many Gospels in the early church. We know they existed. Some have been dug up: the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Judas, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Gospel of Thomas, etc., etc. So these Gospels were all treasured by some Christian communities somewhere in the Roman Empire. They weren't seen as apocryphal, bad books, and we only have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The way to frame this, perhaps, is to say that there was never in the early centuries a thing called Christianity as we understand it. What do I mean by? We're talking about Christianities. So, for example, you had the Jewish Christians, or the Ebionites, as they were called by the early fathers. Jewish Christians who upheld the law, who saw Jesus as a Messiah, a prophet of God, born of a virgin, not God. Yeah. You also had so-called Marcionites. Marcion was a first and second century Christian leader. Died born in 85 AD, and he taught that Paul was the only true apostle, and Jesus' message was entirely separate from Judaism. And he believed in 2 gods: the demiurge, the god of the Old Testament, kind of a harsh, inferior deity, and the true God, who is the higher deity of love and mercy revealed by Jesus. And Paul was the only true apostle and rejected the Old Testament. Why I mentioned him is because the movement, it was a Christian movement, was hugely popular in what we call Turkey today, in Asia Minor and other places in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. Another movement was the Gnostic Christians, and they were all over the place. And they were often monotheists. They believed sometimes in hundreds of gods. Some of them believed in 365 gods, and they believed through esoteric knowledge. That's what gnosis means, Gnostic. One gains salvation. And so I've just mentioned a few there: the Ebionites, the Marcionites, the Gnostic Christians, and then you have what Bart Ehrman calls the proto-Orthodox Christians, and we would see these as what we would see as Christians in that sense. And Marcion apparently was the trigger for the proto-Orthodox Christians to compile the New Testament. Marcion, we still compiled a canon of the New Testament, which include the works of Paul, of course, and a version of Luke's Gospel, and that was it. No Matthew, no Mark, no John, no other books. And he said this was the true canon, and of course it was believed in two gods. The demiurge and the true God. He rejected the Old Testament because it was Jewish and the inferior God. And this apparently, well, many scholars think this kind of prompted the proto-Orthodox to actually respond to this with the correct canon of Scripture. So they included Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Paul's writings and other writings as well. So this was kind of the trigger historically for, it wasn't the first canon, but it was. The thing is, even by the 3rd and 4th century, the canon hadn't been settled. You get people like Eusebius in his Ecclesiastical History, this book. He actually talks in the 4th century about what is in the Bible, the New Testament, I mean. And he says some works are disputed or very dubious. For example, the 2nd letter of Peter is seen as very dubious. The book of Revelation is highly disputed. So the issue hasn't been settled even in the 4th century. And if you look at the Codex Sinaiticus, which is the earliest complete New Testament in the world, I mean, literally is a couple of miles from where I'm sitting in the British Library here in London. It has 2 books in it, which no Christian, to my knowledge, has ever accepted. One is the Epistle of Barnabas, not the Gospel, but the Epistle of Barnabas, and the Shepherd of Hermas. These are in the New Testament in the Codex Sinaiticus. So this is the Codex Sinaiticus was probably written in about 350 AD. And another very similar one is the Codex Vaticanus, slightly later perhaps. Now, I mention all this to give the sense of the fluidity of the canon. It's not like the Quran, where you have 114 surahs that reveal to one person at one time in history. Everyone accepted them as scripture. No. In the early church, or the early churches, there were different Christianities. The Jewish Christians apparently had a Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew, according to some other sources, which is not our Gospel, because that's in Greek, originally written in Greek. I mentioned the Marcionites having their version, the Gnostics having their Gospel, the Gospel of Thomas, for example, which is really a list of sayings. But anyway, they call it the Gospel of Thomas, which is very Gnostic in flavor. So there are lots of different understandings of who Jesus was, and they all claim to be apostolic and from Jesus. They all claim to be the true Christianity, but clearly they're not compatible, you know. And the proto-Orthodox, someone mentioned Athanasius, who believed that Jesus was God in the same way that the Father is God. It's a million miles from the Ebionites. It's a million miles from the Marcionites, who believed in 2 gods. So it's a very, very baggy Christianity's kind of field with lots and lots of different, I think they're different religions actually, but they all come under this single umbrella Christianity, but they're not really the same in my view.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Charlotte, did you have anything you want to say real quick?
Yeah, I want to ask something, but first of all, Paul, may God bless you. Wallah, you're like the amount of videos I've watched, the amount of help that helped me, we helped convert people just because of the content you put out. The amount of like blessings you gave us, may God bless you, Wallah. May God, preserve you and everything. May God you keep you on the right path. And thank you for the lecture today. It's been really well. It's very informative and very good. And yeah, so I have this question that's it's not a question, but it's kind of a statement Christians put out, and I want your opinion on it, which is, what's your opinion on Christians saying they can reconstruct the Bible only based on church father quotes, like prior to the 4th century, 5th century, something like that?
Yeah, this is just nonsense. You can't do that. And the thing is, early church fathers, when they quote the Bible, i.e., what became the New Testament, they're often not quoting it accurately. They're often paraphrases. They're from memory often, and they don't have a New Testament. At least the early fathers, like Ignatius of Antioch and Justin Martyr, and they don't have our New Testament. It didn't exist as a complete canon at that time. They had parts of it, but not all of it. So it's just an urban myth that you could reconstruct the whole New Testament. Firstly, it's anachronistic. The whole New Testament didn't exist in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries anyway, or even 4th century. There's still disagreement. Codex Sinaiticus, for example. But also the quotes are usually paraphrases or memory of what Jesus may have said in John. They're not exact quotes very often. They're very imprecise. So and also, all of the verses in the New Testament? No, you couldn't reconstruct the whole of our 27 books in the New Testament from quotes from the early church. I think this is a bit of evangelical propaganda rather than any serious. I've never heard a scholar ever say this. No scholar thinks, well, we can reconstruct the Bible from looking at the early church. No one says this.
What about Bar Ehrman? I think he might. He says it.
He doesn't. He doesn't. No.
He doesn't.
I don't think he would do that. No.
If I may add real quickly, just before you go.
Thank you so much.
William L. Peterson, he's a great scholar. He writes regarding the results of, there's a Oxford committee of 1905 regarding the reception of the New Testament and the Apostolic Fathers. And a part of this, the researchers, the methodology is they ranked the likelihood that a specific father demonstrated knowledge of a given book that's in the New Testament, right? By assigning each possible intersection a letter grade from A to D. And just to summarize it quickly, they found that only 7 for A grades, which is exact quotes, 7% of the New Testament we have today. So for the most part,
that sounds more realistic. Yeah.
So
I agree.
93% of the New Testament in the Apostolic Fathers is either quoted from memory, paraphrased, rewritten differently, or a form of harmonization. So.
The Apostolic Fathers, like Ignatius of Antioch, the New Testament didn't exist then. So this is works that did exist, like the 4 Gospels, which came to be seen as part of a New Testament, but were not in the New Testament as we understand. Because that canon of 27 books, and only those books, didn't come to be finally definitively decided upon centuries later.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I guess that's it.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. We really do appreciate you. Barakallahu feek for your time and everything that you've done today. And I know it's not likely that we'll see you again on this app, but we really do wish you would honor us with your presence again, inshallah.
You're very kind. I'm very grateful. Thank you very much. And Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Thank you. Thank you.
Alhamdulillah. Very good discussion.
All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. Remember that we have 3 more events and more after these, after the one from today. Make sure you guys check out the events upcoming in the calendar and make sure to hit interested, inshallah. And we appreciate you guys watching. Let's go join the public chat, inshallah, so I can grill all of you.
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah.
Just make sure Randall doesn't come in here. Then we're good.
It's interesting to note that the water into wine miracle, I mentioned it, I brought it up with him because I come from the position that it was a fabrication. typically in the Pauline by the Pauline to
السلام
appeal
عليكم
more to the
ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Gentiles.
السلام عليكم
Alaikum
ورحمة
salam wa
الله
rahmatullah.
وبركاته.
Yeah, yeah.
Adama.
I don't think he holds really to the theory, servant, then John is of a Pauline school, or the writer of John is of a Pauline school.
Yeah, but I mean, we see a deviation in the tradition of the Johannine Gospel versus the Synoptics. So, because in the Synoptics we don't really get this, but in the Johannine tradition we get a higher Christology, and that miracle, or just miracles typically would be associated with in that likeness. But I was trying to make a correlation because based on the evidence, it seems reasonable to suggest that this miracle was kind of like a Pauline invention in order to appease the Hellenistic Jews and Gentiles that with customs they're familiar with, such as drinking alcohol, drinking wine, something that's less less of a prohibition to them. So it's interesting.
Joe, do we just end the event from the calendar?
Yeah.
Oh, you already ended it? Okay.
Nah, that pull down though, that ending, how he pulled down his laptop, wallah, that was Zora. Wallah, that was
Zora, wallah.
Nah, wallah, that shit was so sick. That was so sick. Like him just pulling down his laptop instead of actually leaving the call. Aura right there.
He just unplugged his PC. He didn't even actually leave.
Yeah. Exactly. Nah, like that nigga had enough. Khalas. Like he's leaving.
Yeah.
Nah, he glazed the shit out of him, bro.
It's the head of the server, actually.
The server bottom.
The heads of the server, actually. The heads of the server.
Shola, I got a question.
Yeah, you can reach him by email. So if you wanna ask him questions, he takes email. Yeah.
Yeah, may Allah bless him. Allah, his YouTube channel is huge and he brings really esteemed guests. He himself is underrated, honestly.
Shola,
Yeah, what?
Shola, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Shola,
Shola, I got a question.
Go ahead. Yeah. I said that like 3 times.
Please tell me, in such a setting, what were you doing on the stage?
On the stage?
I don't get it. What was your presence doing on the stage?
I had to glaze real quick,
He asked the question, but,
Okay.
So wait,
No, like, when you were done with the question, you should have left the VC the stage immediately.
No, I added more to the question. Follow up.
Like I just saw you join, and the stage went like from 70 people to 50 people.
And my bad to anybody whose question, like in a side, didn't get answered. It's just some of the questions were not very on topic, and we saw that the Ustad was agitated with some of it. Well, not agitated, but he didn't want, he wanted the questions to stay on topic, specific to what was mentioned. So, sorry for your question.
By the way, Zan, I just wanna highlight something. There were some people in chat trying to disrespect him. Like it's really disrespectful. He can read the chat, by the way. Or he's not understand. Why is he teaching? Why is he this? Like some crazy shit.
I couldn't catch all of them. I hope the mod did what they were supposed to do.
Yeah.
No, I don't think he was reading the chat.
Ethan, do you realize that we couldn't delete any messages?
Oh my
thank
God,
you,
no!
Thank you, Joe. Thank you.
Oh, I didn't
Oh,
meet
really?
him when I muted that Tywin guy. The presentation.
Beth,
Yeah,
I'm really glad
Tywin.
you-
Actually, you went too far, bro. Tywin, too far. Actually, some of the
I think
stuff
it
was
was
fine. I think it was like literally taking the piss at like a
He was
professor.
shitting out memes. Honestly.
No, actually, dude, some people thought this was a debate. They were asking me like, "Yazan, hurry up, speak, bro." I was like, what are these idiots talking about? I don't read the title.
That's crazy.
Yo, Beth.
Is the brother still here? You asked a question about what book recommendations for like text. You asked regarding like textual criticism.
No, Beth, I just want to say I'm really glad.
Just DM me. I can send you some sources.
Yo, Moon,
I don't speak from that. I don't speak from
That's a good book. Like starters book. Like there's some other ones that go more into the variant. Okay, yeah, you are a beginner. My fault. I'm overestimating you. Sorry.
Yo, Yazan, I'm gonna gift you Nitro, okay?
What'd you say, what?
And I said I wanted to thank you for not letting Beth talk on the stage because I know
I didn't
Paul would have left.
request to talk on the stage.
Moon
I
and
didn't.
Tommy.
I would have.
No, I'm glad.
Sure, yes. Yeah.
No, he doesn't want Nitro. He does not accept gifts from Jews. So
What do I do if I'm building furniture and the thingies won't fit?
Moon and Tommy. Mute me.
the first thing to do is talk in English, please.
Well, I can't build furniture.
Yo,
No,
Moon
hang on,
and
let me show
Tommy.
you.
Somebody,
Can anyone
Hey, look.
can anyone find a Jew?
Well, I'm trying to put that in there, right? And it's like blocks. It's like not fitting. What's that in? Oh, I'm trying to press in, but then I'm trying to like do like that to try to see if there's anything in
yo,
it.
can a moderator unmute me? Can a moderator unmute me,
Like,
please?
look. I don't have a hammer. Yeah, but I'm scared I'm gonna hammer it in the wrong way and then it's gonna like thingy. Nah, it's not gonna work this. I'm not meant for labor. Let me try do it with my hand. If I break my hand, I break my hand. It's like a box unit to go in my bedroom. I built my coffee table, but I ruined it. Because I was putting the screws in the wrong way around. That's what I get for trying to be a strong, independent woman. That's what I get. Oh, figure out why it's like that. Hang on. You get because I accidentally jammed something in there. I forgot I did that. So one sec. I've got a knife. I've got a knife and I'm gonna stab it. Try get out. Yeah. Oh, I've got it. Oh my gosh. I'm doing so good at this. I'm so proud of myself. Oh my gosh. Right. This is honestly, I'm working so hard and I'm so proud of myself. Oh shit.
Yo, Cal, bro, what are you doing, man? So weird.
Oh, my God.
Okay. Right. A. How many do I need? I need 8 A. Three, 4.
Bro, is Alastair here? Is he here?
Alright,
I want to grill this. Hold on.
Yo, Moon.
Oh,
Can you Moon? Can you unmute me?
what?
Can you unmute me?
No. Who's that? Please get unmuted.
I'm
What's your
muted.
name?
Look, I literally have the jail and muted role, dog.
Okay, what did you get muted for? What did you get muted for?
Bro, I don't know. Somebody muted me while I was talking in the
Don't
state.
mind, please tell the truth. What did you get muted for?
Wow, I'm literally trying to tell you. I'm saying I was talking in the stage chat. You feel me?
And you were trolling, were you?
I called a Christian a cross looker and a silly concubine, but
Oh yeah, good idea. Good idea. Well done. Hope you proud of yourself.
I reassured my affairs. So please, may I get
You're not
muted?
getting unmuted. You're not getting unmuted because why would you try to provoke Christians? That's your own fault.
They provoked me. Christians don't provoke Muslims? Are you being for real?
No one said that. But in this instance, okay, it sounds like you provoked and you mocked their religion, and that's not acceptable here. So you can deal with however long you've got muted for. Okay,
No,
stop asking
I
me.
never got I never got muted for a specific time.
All right, bro. You're a grown man. Stop complaining about a mute, man. You're an adult.
I'm not.
Chill out.
I'm not an adult. I'm literally, bro. Okay, buddy.
Come on, grow up, bro. Just a mute.
Bro, I'm trying to pay core blocks to the homies, bro.
No one cares, bro. It's not that deep, bro. Stop.
It's like, nah, it's not that deep.
Literally, it's not deep at all.
There's the hadith narrated that says whoever fulfills the needs of his brother, Allah will fulfill his needs.
Oh my god.
Okay, but you're in the wrong here, buddy. So you don't want to hear it.
Okay, so who do I apologize to so I could get muted?
You gotta deal with it. You gotta deal with your timeout. You gotta deal with your timeout.
You don't.
I never got.
Let me finish. You broke rules of the server. An apology doesn't get you unmuted for that. You have to just wait. It's not an instance where you
I never
apologize.
got muted for like a specific time. Like, you feel me?
Well, ping the moderator that muted you.
I don't know where he is.
Look. If you want to get unmuted, you need to go ask forgiveness from the Christian. And once it's confirmed that he's forgiven you,
I cool, but I can't. How can I do that?
In DMs, go do it in DMs, and then screenshot it and then send it back to us, and then we'll release it.
I ain't gonna lie. The Christian that was here, I think he got banned because he was like, feel me, crashing out with some shit.
Damn.
You feel me?
Hey, mate, you feel me? Hey, you feel me? Joe, sir, are you lying to me, brother?
Yo, Moon, don't mock me. You're literally from the UK. The sun don't shine over there, girls.
It's actually like 20-something degrees.
Yo, yes, damn, brother. Can you unmute me?
You were just told what you need to do in order to get unmuted.
That person, I don't even know who he is, bro. You feel me?
Oh, so you just blasted him.